Content Director here at Actual Media. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion on disaster resilient infrastructure. Before we get started, I'll give you a quick tour of the Crowdcast platform so you are able to get as much great information as possible out of today's session. By now, you've probably noticed everyone checking in on the right-hand side with the chat feature. Please say hello, let us know who you are, where you're from. Right above the chat, you'll see an Actual Media icon. If you click follow, you'll continue to be updated about our INFRAIntelligence series as new webinars are announced. And down below, you'll see a variety of information. You can see how many people are signed into today's webinar. You'll see the polls feature where we encourage you to cast your votes. You also see a little green button with rotating links to the speakers' websites. So be sure to check those out too. But most importantly is the Ask a Question feature. So please don't be shy about becoming part of the conversation. I'll do my best to pose your questions to our panelists throughout the discussion where it makes sense. And this is our first INFRAIntelligence webinar of the new year. We wrapped up 2021 with an interesting discussion about an integrated project delivery. If you missed it, you can still access the recording of that session on the Renew Canada event page. And today, we're kicking off 2022 with a focus on disaster resilient infrastructure. We have an impressive lineup of speakers joining today's conversation, but before I jump in and introduce them, I would like to take a few moments to acknowledge the many First Nations and Indigenous peoples of Canada as the original stewards of this great country. I'm here in Toronto, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and of course the Wendat peoples. We all share in the responsibility of our natural infrastructure, and there is much we can learn from the traditional knowledge of the land, water, and materials that allow us to build projects that benefit all Canadians. All right, so let's meet our experts. I'm going to begin by inviting each of our panelists to the screen. Once they're all on screen, I'll have them spend just a couple minutes to introduce themselves and quickly tell us a little bit about where they're from, who they're with, and what role they are bringing to today's conversation. First up, we have Quentin Chiotti from Matrix Solutions. Give him a second to get on up to the screen here. There you go. Hello, Quentin.
Good morning.
Then we have John Gamble from the Association of Consulting Engineering Companies. There he is. Good morning, John. And then next up, we have Elise Perret from WSP. Good morning, Elise. And then we have Ryan Ness with the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. There he is. Perfect. Welcome. All right. We will start with you, Quentin. Can you please give us your introduction, who you are, where you're from, and what perspective you're bringing to today's conversation?
Sure thing. I am the practice lead for climate risk at resiliency at Matrix Solutions. I've been working in the space of climate risk now for almost 30 years, from being an academic to working with the federal government, Environment Canada, working for the not-for-profit sector in the environmental movement, also working for the province and in the private sector. And prior to joining Matrix Solutions, I was the subject matter expert for climate risk and resiliency at Metrolinx, which is Canada's largest regional transit agency. And I must say that I learned more about climate risk and infrastructure in the 7 years that I was actually working at Metrolinx than I had in all the other positions that I've had. So I'll be bringing a very broad focus or broad scope rather to this discussion, but certainly drawing upon my 30 years of experience.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, John, you're up next.
Well, thank you, Corinne. And yes, I'm John Gamble. I'm the president and CEO of the ACC Canada. We are a national business association that represents about 400 companies that offer professional engineering and other scientific and management services. Private sector, our members consult to both public and private sectors. And in many cases, they're on the front leading edge of addressing some of these climate change issues and resilience issues. Where I'm coming from is, first of all, the entire supply chain, right from the owner through to the contractors and everyone involved, we have to have the adult decision about how resilient is resilient enough, how safe is safe enough. And then we also have to align our business models, our procurement models, our contractual arrangements, and our risk sharing to align with the public policy objectives of being able to address and mitigate climate change.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, Elise.
So Elise Perret, I'm based in Roslyn, BC in the interior. I work as a national practice lead for climate risk and resilience at WSP Canada in a national team. And we serve federal government, provincial, territorial, municipal sector, but also the private sector in developing solutions for risk and resilience based on infrastructure, natural and built environment. My background is in engineering. I've spent the past 20 years doing design and construction, mostly in the municipal sector, but a little bit of highways work, and have been in the risk and resilience sector for about the past decade. So I'd say that I can bring many perspectives to the discussion. I definitely focus sometimes in on the details and the codes and standards and the engineering perspective, but my team provides that multidisciplinary perspective to providing solutions. So looking forward to the discussion with the panelists.
Great, thank you. All right, Ryan, up to you.
Good morning, everyone. Ryan Ness. I'm the Director of Adaptation Research at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. We are an independent climate research center formed by the federal government to advise governments across Canada on the difficult policy solutions that need, or policy decisions that need to be made in pursuit of Canada's climate goals, both addressing greenhouse gas emissions and on adapting to climate change. Before I joined the Institute about 2 years ago, I worked for many years for the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, where I was the lead of climate programs towards the end of my tenure. And I'm an engineer by background and have worked on climate impacts and adaptation for about 15 years now, with now a policy focus, but previously with a very much detailed focus on impacts to water and drainage and stormwater in my role at the Conservation Authority. I'm interested to bring today sort of a perspective from a high level of what governments are doing and could be doing better to enable the development of disaster and climate resilient infrastructure. And we recently put out a paper on just this subject, sort of a high level assessment of what the cumulative impacts of climate change to Canada's infrastructure might mean in terms of our economic future, and some of the big policy moves that governments can and make and should be thinking about.
Thank you. All right, we've got lots to talk about, so let's jump on in. Canada's climate's clearly changing. We don't need to look much further back than the last couple months to see evidence of extreme weather, extreme temperatures, floods, snowstorms. Each of these weather events bring with them different risks for roads, buildings, water supply, ports, transmission lines, all of the key important stuff that keeps us all communicated and able to move across the country. So today we're here to talk about what's required to increase the climate resilience of the infrastructure supporting Canadian communities. I'm thinking perhaps the best place to start is by looking at what the risks are to our various types of existing infrastructure. When the panel and I met earlier this week to prep for today's session, I asked them which infrastructure was at greatest risk. Was it roads, bridges, buildings, water supply, etc.? They all kind of shifted in their seats a little and looked a bit awkwardly at me. And then they told me, well, it depends. And then we went on and talked about it for about another 45 minutes or so. So I think that's probably as good a place as any to start. So I'm going to pose the question again, but a little differently this time. What infrastructure is most at risk? Is there a priority on where we should start in terms of building, transportation, or water? Or how and why does it depend? Who would like to leap in here on this one? Ryan, do you want to give it a start?
Sure, happy to start. And as you say, Corinne, it really does depend on your frame of reference and your criteria in determining what is most important. But certainly we can look at the intersection between which types of infrastructure and infrastructure systems are most critical for our country's economy and for the well-being of people in the country, and the types of climate hazards that we're going to be experiencing in the future. So we know that flooding, wildfire, more extreme storm events are going to be some of the primary hazards for infrastructure in terms of disasters. And those intersect with transportation infrastructure frequently that gets flooded out or impacted by changing temperatures as well, in a less disaster-oriented kind of way. But transportation very much front and center. We have housing and buildings that are very sensitive to a variety of climate-related risks and hazards that are going to grow in the future, and obviously those have a significant bearing on the quality of people's lives, and as well as on the success of business. And we have our other critical infrastructure, telecommunications, electricity systems, especially, which will be built out to support a net zero economy, potentially creating even more infrastructure at risk if not designed properly. So I think, in a nutshell, it's important, and you know, my word should not be taken as gospel, but the country needs to look at those intersections between the climate that we're going to experience in the future and the types of infrastructure that are both sensitive to that and that really underpin economy and quality of life in this country.
Yeah, I'll jump in here if you don't mind. And Ryan sort of touched on this when talking about intersections. It's not a case of one or the other. Infrastructure is all interconnected. The municipal infrastructure is almost an ecosystem unto itself. The risk is the weakest link in the chain, and that's where we have to start. If we can't access a site, we don't have supply chains. That cascades into other issues. If we don't have potable water, you have health and safety issues. You can't get power. Maybe the water treatment plant doesn't work, or it only works for a limited time. So it's not a case of choosing which assets we have to focus on. We have to look holistically at the suite of infrastructure assets and then prioritize on that basis. And in fact, going forward, and we talked about this in preparing for this, when we go forward, we have to recalibrate so we're not looking at infrastructure investment or deferred maintenance on an asset by asset, project by project basis. We have to look at asset management plans in their entirety. We have to look at how these things are interconnected. And then we have to look at how different infrastructure assets from different communities are interconnected. It doesn't help you a lot to do flood control if the community upstream hasn't done a whole lot about it either. So we've really got to look at this more holistically.
Yeah, and I would add to that as we have been looking at increasing the resilience of infrastructure on a project by project basis, we run that risk of creating islands of resilience, where you might have one site that's doing great, which actually has detrimental impacts to neighboring sites. And so I think it's also really important that we think about some of our vulnerable populations, which may be more located in some of these floodplain areas that have been historically less expensive to build in, and that really just don't have the ability to respond or go to somebody else's place during a big flood event. And also I'd like to bring in our nature solutions and not overbuilding infrastructure to try to come up with solutions. You know, I think that as we saw with the flooding in the Lower Mainland here in BC this fall, is that nature kind of took over where it used to be. Sumas Lake was a lake, and we decided to try to control it with a dam and pump stations. And what happened during that disaster? It became a lake again. And so I think that as we're looking at systemic land use planning, we should also be thinking about what is the consequence of failure, and where is it going to fail if it does?
Okay, I'll just try to jump in and pull some of these threads together. I would say that from my perspective, recognizing that the issue is cross-cutting. And I think for those who operate or responsible for municipalities or individual companies in the private sector, that you recognize that the issue really crosses your existing assets, as John had pointed out, in terms of asset management. There's also the issue of new design, new infrastructure, so design standards, and how do you address climate risks within that context, and then on the operations and the maintenance side. So it really depends where your focus is, recognizing that all of these things are connected. And I think, as John pointed out, there's always the weakest link that is problematic and then causes cascading effects when these disasters occur. But I would also add that, well, I think I agree with Ryan that water is probably the most significant climate risk for the country as a whole. You can't ignore the fact that there are many aspects of climate change that will have impacts on their own right. And then, of course, the interconnections between them, as we found out in BC, it was largely a sequence of heat dome, of drought, of fires, and then months later, with a lag, with that scorched landscape, with the vegetative cover removed, the precipitation had was exacerbated by the lack of vegetative cover to cause those washouts and floods.
Thank you. Wow, there's so much there I want to tackle. I think first I'm going to start with, it strikes me that obviously this integrated approach, I mean, all of these areas, they're integrated, we need to work together, it's all connected, but I'm still curious to know, like, where do you start? What is the jumping off point? I mean, does everybody need to get together collectively and decide on that approach, or, where can we start on all of this? I want to break it down also in terms of, new infrastructure, and then also, of course, existing infrastructure. But maybe where do we start is the first place? Who has to make this tough decision on, which infrastructure we focus on first? I mean, or is it coming up with a larger policy level type thing before anything even starts, before we start putting shovels in the ground?
I would suggest coming up at that grand policy level. Both Ryan and I have been contributing to the National Adaptation Strategy, at least for the advisory table on the natural and built environment. And what we're finding out there is, again, there's intersections between all of the other advisory tables. And I think to have this transformational goal in the medium term, set a goal. Are we going to have resilient communities in the future? Are we going to allow communities to lag behind? Again, I don't think that it is one piece of infrastructure. I think that it is definitely systems that we're looking at and supporting the development of those systems. And that comes from a bunch of different perspectives. Like personally, I look at it from a codes and standards. As an engineer, I would like to be told that the box is changing, because you typically, design within a certain set of parameters, and sometimes you only actually have influence over that project that you're working on. And so the way that I look at it is that unless that high level strategy changes, you're not going to get to that detailed level, and the details are not going to actually be that effective.
I think that's a great point that Lisa's making. I mean, we've seen a decade or more of sort of bottom-up effort by municipalities and other local actors trying to move the resilience yardsticks on their own without really a supportive kind of national vision or provincial level vision frequently, or system of policies to support that activity. So I think it's a to your question, Corinne, it's a nested thing. Definitely priorities need to be set nationally, provincially, and regionally, and then locally. But I think that we're seeing that big gap nationally and provincially at this stage, identifying what is the infrastructure that is most important to prioritize, both existing and potential future infrastructure, and then what are the tools that those governments need to put into place to be able to advance resilience and adaptation when it comes to that infrastructure, as well as what can they do to enable the actors like municipalities that are going to be responsible for deploying most of this infrastructure and building much of it as well. So I think it multi-level, but the top of the hierarchy really needs a lot of work.
Yeah, in that vein, one specific area where we could make I think would have a very positive impact is changing our approach to how we fund infrastructure. Typically, with the cost sharing models, it's a project by project application. and it's a bit of a beauty contest, and people evaluate, and climate lenses and community benefits and whatever else. Because infrastructure is integrated, and because we need to take a long-term holistic view, why are we not leveraging the asset management plans that the federal government does support, that most provinces support, and most municipalities have bought into? Why do we not address infrastructure funding on the basis of the asset management plans? So instead of saying, I've got, over the next 30 years, I have 10 projects I'd like to execute, and then you'll get in the queue each year and you put in your application, you may or may not get it. Why can we not tailor the funding philosophy to, we commit to support X% of your asset management plan over the following several years? And as long as the municipality continues to follow that asset management plan, or if they have the changes they made, as long as that's sort of kept transparent, that's the way to approach it. So we don't end up where, hey, we got funding to resurface our road, a year later, oh, we've got funding for our active transportation, let's tear up the new road surface. And then some year after that, oh, we've got new storm sewers, let's rip up the active transportation, the road surface, and put in our stormworks. We need a more holistic, longer term. Most municipalities have bought into it. Why do we not leverage it? With the asterisk and caveat that we will still need, in some cases, to allow applications for individual projects, but we need to shift our focus more holistically and leveraging asset management plans. And that makes good sense even if we didn't have resilience issues.
John, if I can just jump in, I think there's merit in terms of an overall national or provincial strategy. And I think, those of us on this panel would all be in agreement with the need for that. That being said, extreme weather and evidence of climate change has been around for a while. It just isn't this past year where all of a sudden, perhaps with the BC situation, people have jumped up and said, oh my goodness, this is climate change. But I've been at this for 30 years. And if you go back to the Calgary floods in 2013, the floods in Toronto in 2013, my former position was created largely because of a GO train that was underwater and an ice storm that had taken out, some of the electrical power. So, I think we tend to be a reactive society. And if we wait around until we hit over the head and we realize, oh my goodness, we really have to take climate change into account because our infrastructure is at risk, that's a very dangerous position to take. So I think we need to be much more proactive, whether or not it's municipalities, as John said, as mandated in terms of their asset management planning, or within the private sector, be proactive. You are going to be held accountable by your shareholders and others in terms of demonstrating your climate risks, whether or not it's from a transitional perspective on emissions or your physical risks. So I think we need to take action now, do perhaps more emphasis on carrying out climate risk assessments and better understand what those risks are before we wait for someone else to solve the problem.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Touching in on that funding point too, though, John, is and also with the way that projects are funded, is that it's cost sharing at the beginning. And so there is typically a municipal or owner, provincial and federal component to funding capital projects. But then it's left to the municipalities or the owners to maintain them. And so often what is done is just to code or just to standards, because you want to reduce your costs at the capital stage as much as possible, or at least there's incentive to do so. But who comes in when there's a disaster? The feds bring in the military, the feds bring in all sorts of disaster relief funding. And so there isn't an owner incentive to take on or there is an owner incentive to take on additional risk at the project development level compared to building for some disaster that may never happen, but could be catastrophic.
That's an outstanding point, because the upper levels of government will have us believe that the cost sharing for infrastructure is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, or whatever the formula is. But if you actually consider the life cycle of assets, 90% of the cost of most assets, if not more, is the operation and maintenance over the design life. So if you actually look at the total cost of owning infrastructure, it's not 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. It's more like 3%, 3%, and 94% borne by the municipalities. If you look at it, and that's an excellent point. And we need to have, again, one of those adult discussions about who steps up. I mean, we haven't even gotten a suitable solution for deferred maintenance, let alone disaster resilience or disaster mitigation.
And Elise is highlighting sort of the lack of the right incentives being in place, or the right policies being in place to and the right funding to be in place to allow infrastructure owners to actually build that risk into the life cycle of the asset. And that sort of comes back to what I was saying. And as Quentin pointed out, we've known that climate change was going to impact infrastructure for at least 30 years. And technically, you would think that it is in an infrastructure owner's best interest to take that risk into account and build it into both the design and the operations of that infrastructure. But we know that that isn't happening. I mean, BC is just the latest example of the fact that it is not. So that we need to think about the system of all sort of the incentives and resources that are going into infrastructure. I think if we're going to change away from that that moral hazard issue that Elise is talking about, the willingness to take on risk up front.
Yeah, and I think that when you're dealing with climate change and the fact that there are many possible outcomes, mostly from a policy perspective and what governments or countries are able to do in terms of achieving their emission targets. When you look at the array of possible outcomes, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is coming out with their latest assessment reports. And we won't get into the technical aspects of the different scenarios, but we could be looking at 1.5, which personally I think we've already passed that stage. 2 degrees, which is the primary focus of the Paris Agreement and the COP meetings in Glasgow. And I think for the most part, our likelihood of achieving that is extremely small. So then what are we looking at? So, beyond 2030, you're looking at 2.6, 2.7, or maybe as high as 3.5 or 4 degrees. And how that global change translates to your particular region, at the local scale, could be in a country like Canada, catastrophic. So, I think, how do you then design infrastructure with all of those uncertain futures? You have to really apply a risk lens to this process and start thinking about what those possible outcomes are, understand what your risk tolerance is, rely, as Elise had said, natural infrastructure and natural assets as part of your response, and recognize that the unexpected is likely to happen.
Yeah, well, for over a century, we used historical data for most cases to design our infrastructure. And of course, with the change being A, rapid, and B, very uncertain, we now have to get into more predictive models, into scenario planning. And with that is going to be, we're going to have to rethink the risk sharing that goes with this. Because it's one thing to point at a table that's compiled over many decades. But if those have gone out the window, and we are now sort of having to use our crystal balls, informed crystal balls, modeling, and all these other sound approaches, we have to have a new and frank discussion about how risk gets shared. And it's got to be risk sharing, not just risk transfer.
Which, you know what, John, you just got me thinking again about our discussion on procurement and sharing of risk in different types of procurement processes. Quentin and I were working together on the Union Station project, where it was an alliance model that was delivering. So you've got the engineer, the owner, and the contractor all working together in a kind of design build partnership. But we're all having those discussions up front so that you get the different perspectives. Who is best to take on that risk? Who is best to understand it? And so that it's not a document that comes out and then somebody responds to it, is that you're really looking into those partnerships. And I think that you could probably provide a little bit more information on how procurement can actually influence the resilience of infrastructure projects.
That's right. And a delivery model is only as effective as the procurement used to do it. And unfortunately, not in all cases, but much of public procurement is very focused on saving money in the short term. Often there's political pressure to say that the government must appear to save money regardless of the cost. And it's tough enough to actually address true life cycle costs under the best of circumstances, let alone trying to address for disaster. And having a downward pressure on price just so you can save money on the design so that you can throw it over the fence to a contractor who's going to try and get the price down lower again. And again, our friends at the municipality end up holding the bag when you don't achieve the design objectives, when you have reduced life cycle, you have substandard materials. It all might be compliant with the drawings. Everyone might have fulfilled their contract, but the philosophy of procurement too frequently is viewing the design, the planning, to be a cost to be minimized rather than treating it as an investment to be leveraged.
Thank you. We have a number of questions rolling in here. I think we've kind of touched on the first one quite a bit, but I'm just going to pose it to you so that we can come at it from a slightly different angle here too. So the asset management approach John recommended is the right approach. However, how municipalities develop their AMPs varies widely. There's no consistency in how infrastructure backlogs are measured, how assets are prioritized, and as a result, how needs are identified. How can we address this issue? Whoop, my screen just disappeared there. Where did the question go? It's answering on the side here. I'll have to go to the next one. Okay, so who pays for resilience? Governments are often on the hook to provide financial assistance when disaster strikes, but if a private owner builds on a floodplain, are they not liable? Where do taxpayers and insurance companies draw the line? Who wants to start?
I'm not sure if there's anyone on the panel who's has the knowledge to answer that, but I was on a session yesterday on emergency management and business continuity planning. And one of the speakers had talked about the gaps, of course, from the private insurance in terms of flood risk and payouts, and the fact that the federal government, as you've noted, has been, those costs have been increasing. So it's better understanding through, looking at nationally flood mapping and then trying to come up with a mechanism to protect Canadians who fall between the cracks and are not eligible for flood insurance. But I think part of the problem is we have a legacy of poor planning, poor land use planning, as Lisa was chatting about earlier. Some provinces are ahead of the game, but other provinces and other parts of provinces are still at considerable flood risk.
All right, thank you. We seem to have a little bit of technical stuff here. Go ahead if somebody else wanted to jump in there. It's like we lost John temporarily a little bit. Is anyone else seeing?
I can still see John, so I think
that's good. It must be me.
He's hearing us. So to what Quentin was saying, and the question of sort of responsibility for recovering after a disaster, for example, both the public and private actors, and Quentin was talking about this, how our system of insurance and relief is sort of broken. Most of the people that were affected by the BC floods, for example, most of the people whose homes were flooded could not get flood insurance because it's not available in Canada from private insurers in areas that are actually at high risk of flooding. And the insurers are not stupid. They're not going to get themselves in a situation where they have to pay out more than they can possibly take in terms of premiums. It just doesn't make sense for their model. Like Lisa was saying, the government, often the federal government matched by the provinces, steps in to help with recovery, whether it's public infrastructure or private assets that are impacted by disasters. The government tends to step in because it's politically a good move. And I mean, those people are genuinely up the creek, as it were, with no kind of source of financial support to be able to rebuild other than governments providing this disaster relief. But what it does is it perpetuates this cycle of building things, building infrastructure, building homes in areas of risk. There's nothing to nudge things in the right direction because there's this backstop that is felt that can be relied upon. So whether it's substandard municipal infrastructure that's not taking climate risk into account, or whether it's a home built in a floodplain, there aren't the right package of nudges, of incentives, of regulations, of policies to move things in the right direction. And one more thing, I guess, on that though, Quentin pointed out as well, we often don't know where these risks exist. Flood mapping, which should be one of the most fundamental products that exist in a country that help you understand where one of your biggest climate risks is going to affect people, is out of date, is incomplete in Canada, and doesn't reflect climate change. 500,000 people in Canada who are probably at risk of flooding won't find themselves on any flood map anywhere. And flood mapping is the best source of climate-related risk information we have. Forget about hailstorms and wildfires and wind and tornado. So that's another piece of the equation that's missing here if we're actually going to get people to build things in the right way and in the right places.
Yeah, absolutely. Private assets and public assets for that matter, are built in hazardous areas, flood or otherwise, because someone allowed them to. And that's an absence of information, and it's information that's evolving. And with particular case of the watersheds, that's really got to be the federal government, because watersheds don't care about municipal boundaries, they don't care about provincial boundaries, and they don't care about, as we saw with the flooding in the Lower Mainland in BC, they don't care about international boundaries. So the obvious place for that to sit, and the responsibility should be with the federal government. That's only one small piece, though, of allowing the private sector, and by private sector, I just don't mean corporate Canada, but I also mean homeowners and so forth. They need to make informed decisions, and they're relying on the government's regulatory regime and their resources to make good faith decisions. And if we have those, we have to build the risk sharing around that, but we'll never get quite clear of the need for the government and public money to step in extreme, extraordinary cases that could not be reasonably foreseen.
Great. All right, lots of questions rolling in. So as a first step, should we not look at 1 in 100 year event benchmarks for infra projects and calibrate or update those benchmarks that will provide a better footing for design?
Yeah, I think in many cases, we do design for the 1 in 100 event. And when I say 1 in 100 year event, it's actually like, it means that there's a 1% chance that it'll happen in any given year. So the probability is low. And I think that what we have to do is look at, is that magnitude of event actually going to happen more frequently? Flood risk is typically done to a 1 in 200 year event. Sometimes a 1 in 500 year, depending on where you are. And so it's not that all infrastructure is designed like that. And I don't know if it should be potentially to look at what the risk, you do a sensitivity analysis and what does that look like if we were to do that. But I don't think putting a blanket number on it is actually the right way to go there.
Yeah, we have the knowledge and the ability to design for climate resilience. That exists. The big question and the public policy question is the adult discussion about how resilient is resilient enough, how safe is safe enough. And frankly, we can't have a regulation for each and every eventuality. That's the very definition of red tape. We do need probably some benchmarks. We do need some guidance. And we just need, and again, it all ties into risk. We can't make every resident 100% earthquake proof. We can't make every site 100. Otherwise, we just don't have the economic capacity to do that. So we have to have an adult decision: how safe is safe, how much risk can we accept, and then how that risk gets allocated. And that's often the sticking point, because politically, nobody thinks anything's going to happen on their watch.
Yeah, and when I was with Metrolinx, one of the things I admired was the fact that they took an approach that was essentially performance-based. So you're trying to think about standards and design, trying not to be too prescriptive, because the solutions to dealing with climate risks, and certainly from a water perspective, is that it's diverse. It could be, a hard asset response. It could be green infrastructure and everything in between. So, I think as long as we recognize that the past is no indicator of the future, and that, yes, a 1 in 100-year event is an important standard from a water perspective to design to, as Elise pointed out, we know that with climate change, that 100-year event could become a 1 in 50-year event. And in fact, the new 100-year event is going to be much higher. So, going back to the notion of building back better or building new smart, I think we need to have a good idea of what that future climate will be. And then I think it was John who pointed out, or Ryan, it's really the risk tolerance eventually will determine where you land in terms of the design.
And I do want to be clear that I don't believe that municipalities willingly have a lower risk tolerance or a higher risk tolerance. I think that they're actually being, kind of pushed into it based on their ability to pay for the life cycle of their infrastructure. And so you talk to anybody who's in municipal government or local government, they'll say, absolutely, we don't want our infrastructure to fail, but we only have this much funding. And so public perception of infrastructure is not at the highest. Most people are looking for the things that beautify, or, let's have our arena updated so we can go play hockey, or, the things that most people think about. Infrastructure only actually comes to top of mind when you turn on the tap and the water doesn't come out, or you can't flush your toilet, or you can't access your home, or you can't get on the highway. Like this is, I just had the experience coming from the Lower Mainland. I was on vacation in November. I was driving through the Lower Mainland and could already see the farmers' fields like filled up with water. And then we got the big atmospheric river. I was back in the Kootenays by that time, up at 1,000 meters outside of flood risk. But guess where all of our produce comes from? And we were effectively on an island, 3 highways connecting the interior to the Lower Mainland, where our agricultural hub is, all of a sudden got cut off. So later that week, I go to the grocery store, no produce. And it was shocking. Now, the next week it came back, and we definitely have some resilience in our systems here, but it's that emotional connection to risk and infrastructure, and that people don't really think about it until it isn't there. And except for us, and people like us.
Because infrastructure is exciting.
It is.
It's a great point, Elise, that it's really hard to persuade a municipal decision maker, municipal politician to spend more money on a cost that may or may not occur over their political lifetime, or even over their actual lifetime. It's until it becomes concrete. Sort of the human brain doesn't prioritize these kinds of distant and abstract risks. Just one more thing I wanted to say as well about standards and for sort of climate risk is that there are some really smart people working on updating building codes and infrastructure standards to reflect climate change at the Standards Council of Canada, at the National Research Council. But those processes are just so slow. Like they're just getting those rolling out now. They could take 5 years or more in the case of building codes, for example, to be sort of adopted countrywide. We just don't have enough time. It feels like there's so much infrastructure being built. The net zero transition is going to accelerate the pace of many kinds of infrastructure development. Something needs to be done about the glacial pace of those updates.
Yeah, Corinne, with your indulgence, you started off on a question about shall we say the unevenness of
right.
asset management plans and the capacity of municipals to provide them, and that is very important because again, it's a little bit of the weak link in the chain. And this is not a knock against municipalities that may not have as robust asset management plans. It's really an issue about capacity. It's an issue about the size and scope. And we need to support that. And up until about 10 years or so, the FCM and the National Research Council had a wonderful program called the National Guide to Sustainable Municipal Infrastructure, also known as INFRAGuide. And unfortunately, it was sacrificed on the altar of fiscal constraint There was the thought that, well, there should be a user fee for this. However, the municipalities that benefited the most were the ones that probably have the fewest resources. But that kind of establishment of best practices, the ability to share information and share boldness is very powerful. And I think it very much aligns, even though it probably was not contemplated in the way it is today, but the objective of that program very much aligns with some of the things that need to happen to allow municipalities to tackle their asset management plans, to do this planning, and also giving municipal officials the ammunition they need when they need to press the upper levels of government for support. So I would certainly, and it's certainly something we as an association, almost every budget consultation of the federal government, we've been asking for the reinstatement of that program. And we can't just say this is what you ought to do. We need to help and allow that knowledge transfer. And yes, somebody posted here, it is available. It is on a virtual bookshelf, the Gathering Virtual Dust. It is a good program and it can use a refresh. It should be web-based, and we should expressly address the issues of climate resiliency and climate mitigation.
If I could just jump in again, I think one of the things that I have found over the years is that Canadians are reluctant to showcase and highlight their successes. And I think there's a lot of creativity, innovation across the country where we are dealing with climate risks. And yet those stories, those examples are perhaps not being as shared or given the due credit that they should. And somehow dealing with climate risks is a very sensitive topic for some. And I just think that there's a lot of good case studies out there that we can learn from, and may not cost a lot, that are quite affordable, and the benefits that result could be very substantial.
I'm just seeing a comment here from Mark about the support of the Standards Council of Canada and Infrastructure Canada, aided recently by ECCC updates to model future climate change. CSA is updating many of its built infrastructure standards. So one of those is the National Bridge Code. And that is starting to integrate it into many different ways. And it's a really interesting discussion because it's not clear cut as to how you take that information and then apply it to different kinds of climate loads, whether that be wind or hydrotechnical aspects or ice accretion, temperature, all those types of things. So I did want to also highlight another project that the SCC is doing, and it's developing a guide on how to integrate climate data into different types of standards. So that is in progress right now. But as Ryan mentioned, it's a slow process. The codes and standards world is definitely a slower process. And I think that it is really up to, I see it as professionals and community members and community leaders and political leaders to really show that leadership. And because once you know it, you can't unknow it. If I practice in British Columbia, but I also practice in Northwest Territories and Nunavut, and I practice in Ontario. And the way that I look at it is that there's a guideline that tells me how to practice engineering in terms of highway design in British Columbia. I can't, in good conscience, as a professional, go to Ontario and not consider those same aspects, even though it is not a part of the regulations there.
That's such a good point. I would love to see if we can kind of divert this a little bit. I feel like we've talked at length, which I love, about sort of the integration and what's needed to drive this. I wonder, are there any projects that we can look at as examples of things that are being done really well right now, whether it's refurbishments, new projects that are, or even whether it's the technology, or maybe it is the policy development or that kind of thing. But I would love to know if there are places we can draw on for inspiration that are successfully making some good strides in terms of development of resilient infrastructure. Anybody got something they'd like to share?
I'll just jump in because one of the comments that was just made regarding the case studies that are available through the federal government, the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, the climatedata.ca case studies here, changingclimate.ca. And people can go there and learn from best practices that have been applied in different parts of the country. But I think that there are just so many that are out there, and I know many cases where there have been really good climate resiliency measures put in place, and yet they weren't highlighted. Like I see stories about, and I don't want to call out any individual site or specific infrastructure, but it's exceptional design in terms of dealing with climate risk, and yet it isn't part of the narrative. And I think we need to have a stronger collective narrative that climate risk is real, it's an important area, and how are we actually addressing it?
That's interesting. Anyone else on the panel? Go ahead.
Just to add to what Quentin was saying, I mean, it's hard to write a news story about an area that didn't flood.
That's true.
There's a really interesting project in downtown Toronto on the mouth of the Don River where an entire sort of precinct was taken out of a zone of flood risk, and it's now been successfully developed and has not sort of come anywhere close to flooding since that time. But how do you say something sexy about that? Unfortunately, it's hard to promote. I'm sure Elise and John will have some really good sort of project level examples. Just from a policy perspective, Corinne, to your question of positive developments, I think that the federal task force on flood insurance and relocation that Quentin I think was talking about earlier or alluded to is an important step. It actually is looking into the sort of getting people off disaster assistance, as it were, and trying to create a system that gives people that are in harm's way when it comes to flooding an insurance lifeline that's separate from disaster assistance, and that can be evolved over time to create incentives to get people to potentially not rebuild or to protect their properties where they can. So there are some big policy moves like that are happening at the federal level. I think that they could be expanded. There's analogies in all kinds of different areas where the federal government and provincial governments could support municipalities in that respect.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit to some of the public policy. I'm always reluctant to sort of call, I love all my members equally, and I don't want to show favoritism one over the other. They're all wonderful. But one opportunity we have is the recently proposed National Infrastructure Assessment. Taking not the 5. I mean, kudos to Infrastructure Canada from going to a year-over-year to a 5-year, 10-year, now 12-year window. But now we're talking in the range of 30 years. We're talking about much more comprehensive. And our hope is, if done correctly, because it can be a very powerful tool, just from the economic management of infrastructure, but it's also potentially a very powerful tool to address a lot of the resiliency and climate change issues if done correctly. And that'll require some independence of the direction of the assessment. It's got to be pretty comprehensive at looking at the current state of our infrastructure, and there's a lot of work there. I've been on the advisory board for the Canadian Infrastructure Report Card, and of course, the very first one we did, the biggest conclusion was we need more asset management in this country. But we need to get a handle of that, federal assets, provincial assets, because they're all interconnected. We need to set a vision. As former Minister McKenna talked about, are we also building the right infrastructure? So and then we got to put together a little bit of a roadmap there, and then we've got to continually measure our progress. And I think this could be a powerful tool. And the government's made some strides. It seems to be a little bit stalled since the election, but I think this is something that's really worth investing in. And I think it's something that could be useful to all levels of government if done correctly.
Fantastic. Anyone else like to jump in before we move on? We are down to our last 6 minutes here, so we probably have time for one more quick question, and then I would say bit of a final thoughts kind of thing here. Let's see. In order to encourage municipalities build more resilient infrastructure, how could feds encourage this? And I think we talked about it a little bit. Are there any other ideas in terms of support, incentives, other encouragement? At
I
least
would
you
just
look like you're
offer.
nodding.
I would just offer. We talk a little bit about user fees and cost recovery and things like that. And I think whether we subsidize costs for infrastructure, whether we distribute it from wealthier, that's a public policy, a broader public policy decision. But we really need to understand the true cost of our infrastructure, which I think gets glossed over. It's certainly not the price we're paying at the meter, at least in most cases. And we've got to build in that replacement cost, some level of self-insurance. We've got to have an accurate picture of the life cycle if we can actually accurately assign the cost. Now, how it gets paid for is a broader public policy, whether it's individual users, blanket rates, subsidized rates, another discussion. But we need to get a handle on the real cost, including climate resilience.
And I do want to actually congratulate the federal government in introducing the climate lens, because I've been working in design and construction pretty much my whole career. And it wasn't until the climate lens came out that everybody's like, what is this thing? What is climate resilience? What am I doing? And then all of a sudden I went from being a design and construction engineer to focusing my practice solely on climate risk and resilience, and teaching people and building capacity within the industry to make this happen. So while it might not be perfect to do it on a project by project basis, it has really changed the language and the discussions that are happening within the industry. And I think that is one thing that they can do. They're also doing a lot of other things. They are providing better data that is in a format that is understood better by practitioners. Like when I first started working, like it probably came in, maybe like 12, 13 years ago, we started talking to climate scientists about the RX1 day and how is that going to help you to design a stormwater system. It's not, because we actually use IDF curves. Like having those multidisciplinary perspectives come in has really, really helped provide a common language between practitioners, which has advanced climate resilience.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, so as we're bringing in the home stretch here, I have a big question. I'm going to ask you to answer it in 1 minute, which is what is it ultimately going to take to develop a whole of society integrated approach to build resilience of Canada's? Let me try that again. What's it ultimately going to take to develop a whole of society integrated approach to build resilience of Canada's integrated infrastructure? And I think this is the same stuff that we started out with kind of in the beginning. It needs to be that whole of society approach. John, why don't we start with you, and then we'll just go around and give each of you about a minute.
We'll take some political leadership, but what cultivates political leadership is political leaders knowing that we, collectively, this community and the people participating, are behind them and support this. A lot of the stuff we've talked about today would have made sense even if the planet wasn't on fire or underwater, depending where you are. This stuff would have made sense anyways, but now we're into sort of crisis mode. And this is an opportunity. Well, it's more than an opportunity, because if we don't do it, we're really up the creek or underwater, or down the creek or downstream or whatever. But I think, and by the way, compliments to the quality of the questions and comments that it came through. You could have picked 5 people from the registrants that you could have put them up here on the panel. But I think we need to lean in. I think we've got to be very clear. We got to carry the message, and we got to be consistent, and let the politicians know that we've got cover fire for them if they move forward, because it won't be popular with everyone.
Perfect. Thank you. Lise, would you like to go next?
I think that remembering that this is a complex problem that we're trying to resolve, and that it takes a bunch of different perspectives to come up with really innovative solutions. And so ensuring that we keep the dialogue open between different disciplines, from planners to engineers to ecologists to accountants and insurance professionals. And I'm missing some, I know it, but making sure that we include all of those people at the table and having those open conversations.
Great, thank you. And Ryan.
There's so much that could be said about this. In response to that question, I'll just come back. I'll agree with everything my co-panelists have said, but also come back to the idea that senior governments need to do more than they're doing to drive the practice of building disaster and climate risk into infrastructure. At least cited a great example, the climate lens, which has really driven the development of sort of capacity and expertise in doing climate risk assessments for infrastructure in Canada. There's so many more things and so many more tools available to senior governments through regulation, through funding requirements, through disclosure and infrastructure asset management requirements, and support for those ultimately too, that they can do to help move this along.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And take us home, Quentin.
Well, I'll finish with this thought, in that one point that's often pops up in these types of discussions is, do we have enough information in order to make decisions? And I think for the longest time, we actually have. And, Elise pointed out what the federal government has done beyond Climate Lens in terms of climate data portals and the like. So I would say whether or not it's the tools, whether or not it's the expertise, whether or not it's the data, we've made great strides in being able to have all the information and the tools handy in order to make strong, sound climate risk decisions.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. We certainly wouldn't be able to host important discussions like this one. And today was, just the attendance, the number of comments, the number of questions really shows just how important this subject is and how important it is to a lot of people. So thank you so much to our panelists. And a big thank you, of course, to all of you that are working hard there in the chat box as well. These virtual platforms would not be anything if we didn't have great participation. It really drives a level of intimacy that we wouldn't otherwise be able to achieve. And I should say, we're back here again in March, and I'll be hosting an in-depth discussion then on public transit. Essentially the backbone of livable cities. Better transit means less congestion, faster commutes, higher productivity, and lower emissions. So please don't miss out on this vital conversation. If you follow Actual Media at the top of your screen, you'll automatically get a notification of the latest information on upcoming webinars. So thank you again. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.